The Ice Cream Man. Miami, Florida, June 1st, 1964. The little boy hesitated to put his hand out. He wanted the ice cream, but remembered his mom telling him never to accept any gifts, particularly sweets, from a stranger. The man offered again. "Here, take it. It's toasted almond, my own personal favorite." The little boy, now frightened, turned and ran. When he got a half block away, he stopped and looked back. His friend, Jack Chrissy, was still there, leaning against the man's white ice cream truck, eating an ice cream cone and talking to him. The next day when he got home from school, his mom asked him if he'd seen Jack in class that day. He asked his mother why, and went on to say he hadn't seen him and asked if Jack was sick or something. His mom told him no, Jack wasn't sick. It was just that Jack's mom had called last night and asked if she knew where Jack was because he was late getting home for dinner. "I'll just call her now and make sure everything's all right," she said. "Why don't you go up to your room, Sammy, and start on your homework?" Sammy started up the stairs, stopped halfway, thought maybe he should tell his mom about the ice cream man, but decided not to because he didn't want to get into trouble. After dinner that night, the phone rang many times, and Sammy sensed that something was up. "What's going on?" Sammy asked his mom and dad. So they sat him down at the kitchen table and told him that his friend Jack still hadn't come home, and no one knew where he was. "Do you have any idea?" Sammy's dad asked. "No," Sammy replied. "I was playing with him until I came home yesterday. He was fine when I left him." "Well," said Sammy's dad, "Jack's parents are very worried. They've called the police to look for him. No one knows where he is." As Sammy lay in bed trying to fall asleep that evening, he thought about the man with the ice cream and wondered if he might have taken Jack. The idea of it really scared him, and he tossed and turned all night. The next day in school, all his friends were talking about it. He was really frightened when the school principal called him, along with 6 other boys, all friends of Jack's, to the office. A policeman, Detective Rory Michaels, was there, and he and the principal brought each boy into the office one at a time and asked if they knew anything about Jack's disappearance. All day long in school, Sammy couldn't concentrate. All he could think about was Jack and what might have happened to him. He did tell Mark, his best friend, about it, and Mark told him that he should tell his parents, and Sammy knew Mark was right. Dave Wexler pulled his Good Humor ice cream truck into his 2-car garage, one side of which still contained the unopened boxes he hadn't yet unpacked since moving in almost 2 months ago. Dave had left his job in Detroit as a long-haul truck driver to move to sunny Florida. He always hated winters, and the combination of palm trees, beaches, and warm weather was a welcome change. He had chosen Miami because he found out that there was an opening there for someone to drive a Good Humor ice cream truck. The expected earnings were about the same as he had been getting as a long-haul driver, but now he'd be able to spend most of his time in the local area. He fully expected to make friends and have a good life here. When he had picked up and loaded his truck yesterday for the first time, he was given a map and shown the area that he would cover. A nice residential area, he was told, with lots of kids who would come running when they heard the bells on his truck. He'd driven the route yesterday to get familiar with it and found himself in a middle-class neighborhood, complete with green grass yards and white picket fences. He couldn't wait to get started. The next day, he began his route for the first time, about 30 minutes after school let out, so his best customers, the children, would already be home. About an hour later, when he drove down Sammy's Street, a group of children came running out from their homes and ran up to his truck, all clamoring for an ice cream, their shiny quarters gleaming in their outstretched hands. Sammy ran out with the other kids, but stayed back, a little hesitant, until he saw that the driver was not the same man who'd been there yesterday. As Dave took the quarters, handed out each ice cream, and saw the smiles on the kids' faces, he thought about what a great job this was. When he completed his route, Dave drove to the Good Humor plant and asked George Akins, the handyman who worked there, to please load his truck and get him ready for tomorrow. Then he drove home. A few minutes later, as he pulled up to his driveway, he spotted a young woman standing on his porch about to ring his doorbell. "Can I help you?" he called as he stepped out of the truck. "Hi," the lady said. "I'm your next-door neighbor, and I just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. I've noticed the Good Humor truck in your driveway. Are you the Good Humor man? My daughter Melissa has been asking me to find out. She's been bragging to her friends that the Good Humor man lives next door to her." "Well," he laughed, "I am the Good Humor man. It's good to meet you. My name is Dave Wexler." "Mine is Wendy Johnson," said the neighbor as she held out her hand to Dave. "It's nice to finally have someone in this house. It's been vacant for several months." Dave and Wendy spoke for another few minutes until Wendy told him that she'd better get back to Melissa and begin preparing dinner. Pretty lady, Dave thought, as he went into his house. Jack was really frightened as he looked around the room in which he'd been locked since last night. The ice cream man had seemed so friendly, and it sounded like it would be fun when he asked him if he'd like to ride in the truck with him on the rest of his route. Then, when Jack realized they'd been driving a while, were no longer in his neighborhood, and hadn't stopped to sell any ice cream, he got nervous. "Where are we going?" he asked the man. "I think you should take me home now." "I want to stop at my house first," the man said. "I have a surprise for you there, something I want to show you before I take you home." They continued to drive for another few minutes. When the man pulled the truck over to the curb, "We're getting near my house now," said the man, pulling something out of his pocket. "So I want to put this blindfold on you so I don't ruin the surprise." When they entered the house, the man helped him down the steps into the basement and took off his blindfold. Jack looked around the dingy basement and wondered what the surprise was supposed to be. "Where's the surprise?" he asked, and the man pointed toward the only other room in the basement and told Jack it was in there. But the moment he stepped into the room, the man had closed and locked the door. In a panic, Jack looked around the room and saw there was a bed, a toilet, a table, and a small lamp. "What's going on?" he cried out as he tried to open the locked door. "Let me out!" It had been 2 days now since Jack had disappeared, and Sammy knew he had to tell his parents about the ice cream man. Something had happened to Jack, and that man must be involved. That evening after dinner, Sammy went into the kitchen where his mom and dad were doing the dishes, and he said he had something to tell them. He was really nervous and hoped they wouldn't be too angry with him. I didn't tell you everything about the day Jack disappeared," he stammered. "He and I were playing on the sidewalk when the ice cream truck came by. The driver asked us if we wanted an ice cream, and we told him we didn't have any money. He said that was okay, and he would give each of us an ice cream anyway. Jack took one, and I almost did, but I knew you'd told me never to accept candy or ice cream from a stranger, so I told him no thanks and just came on home. The last time I saw Jack, he was still with the ice cream man." Sammy's dad was upset. "Why didn't you tell us this right away?" he asked. "Have you seen that man around here since?" "I haven't," answered Sammy. "The good humor driver since that day has been someone else. The first one had a beard and a scar on his forehead. The new one doesn't." Sammy's mom picked up the telephone right away and said she was calling the police. "We have to let them know," she said as she began dialing. It wasn't too long until a policeman knocked on their door, and Sammy was glad to see it was the same one he'd spoken to at school. He had been really nice. Jack sat at the edge of the bed, crying. The man hadn't hurt him, but he wouldn't let him out of the room. He said they would eventually become good friends, that he wanted to treat him like his own son, but couldn't do that until he could trust that Jack wouldn't try to run away. Jack had fallen asleep that night crying. It was morning now, and he'd just woken up to find himself still there, still locked up. Jack turned around as he heard the key turn in the lock and saw the door open. The man had a tray with cereal and toast on it. He put it down and walked out, shutting the door behind him without saying a word. "Why are you doing this?" Jack cried. "Why don't you just let me out of here?" Sammy's parents ushered the policeman into the kitchen and motioned for them all to sit down at the table. "I'm Officer Michaels," said the policeman. "I spoke to Sammy at the school a few days ago, and I understand that he has more to tell me." "Yes, he does," answered Sammy's dad. "Go on, son, tell Officer Michaels what you told us." Sammy began to shake. Tears streamed down his cheeks, and for a minute he couldn't speak. I'm so sorry. I should have told you right away at the school." Sammy's mom put her arm around him and whispered softly, "It's all right, Sammy. Just tell us now. Just tell the policeman what you told us." Sammy looked at the policeman and began telling him about Jack and the ice cream man. "He was fine when I left him," Sammy said. "He was just eating an ice cream and talking to the man. And he's not the same man that's been coming around on the Good Humor truck every day since then. That man was someone else." "Do you remember what the man looked like?" asked Officer Michaels. "Can you describe him?" Sammy thought for a moment and told the officer that the man was white, a lot taller than he or Jack, and had dark hair. He also told him that the man had a beard and a scar on his forehead. "That's all I remember," said Sammy. "He seemed nice." "One last question, son," Detective Michaels said. "Are you sure this was a Good Humor truck?" "It was white. It had some writing on it. I'm pretty sure," Sammy answered. The next morning, Wendy Johnson finished cleaning up the breakfast dishes and told Melissa to put her sweater on and meet her in the car. It was time to leave for school. As she drove down her driveway, she noticed the Good Humor truck next door and told Melissa that she'd met the man who'd moved in there, the Good Humor man, and that he seemed very nice. When they arrived at the school, as she was letting Melissa out of the car, she mentioned that after dinner that night, they might knock on their new neighbor's door and even get an ice cream from his truck. Sammy met his best friend Mark in the hallway at school before classes began. They talked about Jack, the Good Humor man Sammy had left him with that day, and what he had told the police officer at home last night. When Melissa walked by, they waved and said hello and brought her into the conversation. As Sammy brought her up to speed about Jack, her expression turned from a friendly smile to a worried frown. "The Good Humor man lives right next door to me," she said. "My mom met him and thinks he's nice," she went on. "I have to tell her as soon as she comes to pick me up." "I don't think that's the same man," Sammy said. "There are two of them. The one Jack was with is very tall and has a beard and a scar on his forehead. The Good Humor man I've seen since then isn't him. Maybe the first one had his route changed." That evening, when Dave Wexler pulled into the Good Humor plant, he spotted George Akins right away. "How are you today, George?" he asked. "Well," answered George, as he scratched the beard on his chin, "not so good. Today is the 1-year anniversary of the accident in which my boy Joseph was killed. I miss him so much. It was just he and I since he was a baby. His mom took off when he was only 2 years old, and we never again heard from her. Now I'm alone all the time, and I miss him so much." "I'm sorry to hear that, George. I didn't know. Say, I'm going home to an empty house tonight. Why don't you come with me? I can grill a couple of steaks, and I'll pick up a 6-pack on the way. Why should either of us be alone?" "I don't know," said George. "I'm really kind of down right now." "That's a great reason for us to do this," responded Dave. "Be good for both of us." Jack finished the last sandwich the man had left for him and lay back on his bed. It was all cried out. No tears left. He stood up, went to the door again, and rammed his body against it. Didn't even budge. "Why has he done this?" he asked himself. Wendy Johnson was busy preparing dinner for herself and Melissa. She looked out her kitchen window and noticed Dave Wexler, along with another man, going into his house next door. His Good Humor truck was in the driveway, and she thought, maybe we'll knock on his door after dinner so Melissa can meet him, and I wouldn't mind some ice cream for dessert. Dave and George were in Dave's backyard. George sitting in a lounge chair and Dave lighting the grill. Both held cans of beer in their hands. 2 thick steaks and 2 potatoes rested on a large plate near the grill. "Say, George," asked Dave, "how long have you worked for Good Humor?" "About 10 months, answered George. "I took this job shortly after I lost my son. I needed to keep busy. For those first few months, I just sat in the house, drank too much, and slept a lot. Before that, I'd worked for myself as a handyman. I can fix anything. That's why Good Humor hired me." After dinner, Wendy washed the dishes while Melissa dried them. "Why don't we go next door so I can introduce you to Dave Wexler and we can get some ice cream for dessert?" offered Wendy. "He's really very nice." Jack paced the floor. "I have to get out of here somehow," he thought. The man hadn't hurt him. He'd made sure to feed him and said he wanted them to become friends. His thoughts wandered. Something's really wrong with this guy, but maybe by acting friendly I can get my chance to escape. Dave and George were just finishing dinner. They ate at the table in Dave's backyard near the barbecue. As Dave handed George another beer, they both heard the doorbell ring. "Can't imagine who that might be," said Dave. "I really don't know many people here yet." Dave went into the house through the back door, walked through the kitchen and down the hall to the front door. There he could see Wendy and what must be her daughter through the glass in the door. He opened the door, said hello, and led them toward the backyard. "Dave," Wendy said as they entered the house, "this is my daughter Melissa. Melissa, this is Dave, the Good Humor man." When they reached the backyard, Jack introduced them to George, saying that he also worked for Good Humor. "Are you a Good Humor man too?" Melissa asked George. "Not really," answered George, "but I do work at the Good Humor plant. I clean the trucks and get them ready for the drivers, and sometimes I have the chance to test drive one I just fixed." "That must be fun," Melissa said, but as she looked more closely at George, the image she had when Sammy had described the man he had last seen with Jack came back to haunt her. Tall, beard, white. This could be him, she thought to herself. A few minutes went by, and Wendy asked Dave if they might get an ice cream from his truck. But before Dave could even answer, Melissa blurted out that she wasn't feeling well and wanted to go home right away. "What's wrong?" her mom asked, and she told her that it was a stomachache and she really needed to go home. Wendy apologized, saying they would come back another time, and they left for home. Once outside Dave's house, Wendy told Melissa that what she had done was rude. "You were fine until I mentioned the ice cream," she said. "I know when you're not telling the truth. Tell me, why did you do that?" At first, Melissa didn't answer her mom. Finally, she started to stammer, I, and then just blurted out, "I think that man with the beard, George, may be the one who Sammy said he last saw Jack with that day." "Are you sure?" said Wendy. "We can't just go around accusing somebody of something so terrible." "Well," she replied, "Sammy said the man was white, tall, and had a beard, and George does work for Good Humor and sometimes drives their trucks. What if it's him? Shouldn't we tell someone?" "Let's get in the house, and I guess I'll call the police," answered Wendy as she unlocked the front door and went in. The phone rang in the police station, and the desk sergeant answered. Wendy tried to explain that she was calling regarding the Jack Chrissy missing boy case. That's when the sergeant interrupted her and told her that the case was being handled by Detective Rory Michaels, and that he would have Detective Michaels call her back as soon as he could. Wendy and Melissa sat at the kitchen table waiting for the phone to ring. Neither said anything until Wendy asked Melissa if she wanted a snack. "Maybe a cookie," Melissa answered, as she stood up to get one. "Do you want one too?" She started to ask her mom, but was interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. Wendy picked it up on the first ring. "Hello," she heard her mom say. "Yes, Detective, this is Wendy Johnson, and I hope I'm not being overly cautious, but—" Wendy went on to explain about her next-door neighbor, the description Sammy had given of the man he last saw with Jack Chrissy and his work at the Good Humor plant, including his access to the ice cream trucks. "This may be nothing, but we just thought we should tell you." After thanking her for calling, the detective said goodbye. Wendy hung up the phone and told Melissa that there was no more they could do. The next morning, Detective Michaels and his partner, Morgan, went to the Good Humor plant and spoke to the plant manager. Without telling him more than they had to, they asked if they could speak to their employee, George Akins. They were taken to a small office down the hallway, and in a few minutes, George entered the room. "Please sit down," Rory told him. "We're police officers. We need to ask you a few questions about where you were on the afternoon of June 1st. Said George, stroking his beard. "I'm not sure if it was a weekday. I was probably right here at work." "It was a Monday," answered Rory. "Do you remember if you were out driving one of the ice cream trucks that day?" "May have been. I just don't remember, but if I was, it would be in the maintenance logs. The only time I drive a truck is to make sure I repaired it right." The detectives thanked George and sent him back to work. On the way out, the detectives stopped again at the plant manager's office and asked if they could see the employee attendance records for June 1st and the maintenance logs for that same day. As they waited for the records, Detective Michaels asked Morgan to start calling any truck rental companies in the area and find out if they had any ice cream trucks, and if so, who may have rented one around June 1st. Jack heard the key in the lock and watched silently as the door slowly opened. The man had several department store boxes with him that looked like they might contain clothing. Jack was sitting at a chair by the table and looked up at the man. "Why am I here?" he asked. "Why can't you just let me go home?" "I brought new clothes I want you to change into. I'm loading up my car, and you and I are leaving here, going far away so no one can find us." The plant manager handed the attendance and maintenance records to the detective. Rory took the attendance records and gave the maintenance papers to Morgan. The information showed that, indeed, George had been at work that day, but that he had not taken any trucks out. On the way back to the precinct, Morgan's cell phone rang. It was the dispatcher to say that they found a truck rental agency that had rented an ice cream truck to a Mr. John Sullivan over the dates that included June 1st. Morgan took down the address and gave it to Rory, who was driving. It was only a few minutes from where they were. John Sullivan carried 2 heavy suitcases as he rushed to load his car for the trip. He knew he was going to have to tie and gag the boy to get him into the car quietly. He didn't want to hurt him. Someday, he hoped they could be close. That's why he was doing this. For them. John went back to the room where he explained to Jack that he was going to have to tie him up and gag him just until they were in the car. Jack was more frightened than ever at this point. His parents must be so worried. He felt scared and in some way even guilty to put his parents through all this. The detectives pulled around the corner and stopped across the street from the address they had for John Sullivan's house. They were about to get out of their car to approach the house when they saw a man with a beard and a scar on his forehead gripping a boy and pulling him towards the car parked in front of the house. They waited until the man had pushed the boy into the car on the passenger side and was walking around the front of the car to get to the driver's side. Together, they pulled out their pistols, opened their car doors, and yelled to the man, "John Sullivan, police, put your hands in the air." John slowly turned towards the police and put up his hands. Detective Michaels had him turn around and cuffed him. Officer Morgan opened the passenger door and undid Jack's gag. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," answered a frightened Jack. "Thank God you found me. He was about to take me out of town." "Well, you're safe now," Morgan told him. "We're going to take you both down to the station, where he'll be charged with kidnapping, and we'll get a hold of your parents." Melissa was in her kitchen eating an ice cream cone. Wendy and Dave sat down in Wendy's living room talking about everything that had happened with Jack and how the police had first suspected George. "Well," said Dave as he reached out and took Wendy's hand, "the best thing that happened, of course, is that Jack is safe and back with his parents. The next best is that I moved in next door and met you. And the next best thing is the ice cream cones you brought over. That and the fact that I can tell all my friends that I live next door to the Good Humor Man," shouted Melissa from the kitchen, where she'd obviously been listening in to their conversation. At that, they all laughed. Life was back to normal.